Welcome to the debate.
Today, we're looking at the aftermath of World War I, specifically the Treaty of Versailles from 1919.
Yeah, a really pivotal moment. The challenge for the architects of that treaty was immense, wasn't it? How do you even begin to address the sheer scale of destruction from modern industrial warfare?
Exactly, and that leads us straight to our central question today. Did the Treaty of Versailles, which was intended, to punish Germany and prevent more conflict, actually end up sowing the seeds for World War II?
Right. And I'll be arguing that yes, its punitive nature was fundamentally self-defeating. It arguably created the very political and economic instability that made a second global conflict not just possible, but perhaps tragically predictable.
And I'll argue that, while the treaty certainly wasn't perfect, it was a necessary framework. It aimed to establish post-war security, and importantly, it tried to usher in a new era of international cooperation, even if the later political follow-through had serious flaws.
Well, from my perspective, the Treaty of Versailles failed because it was really driven more by vengeance than by a desire for genuine, lasting stability. And its fatal flaw, I think, is concentrated in one specific clause, Article 231. The so-called war guilt clause.
Mm-hmm.
This wasn't just some, historical footnote. It acted almost like a legal and psychological poison pill, essentially guaranteeing the treaty's failure. It forced Germany to accept sole moral responsibility for the entire war, which, crucially, then served as the justification for the absolutely massive financial burden imposed.
Okay.
The reparations figure, estimated at 132 billion gold marks, was, economically crippling. It wasn't just a severe strain. You could argue it was designed to crush the German economy. And perhaps just as importantly, it delegitimized the new Weimar government, the very government forced to sign it. That economic hardship, combined with this profound sense of national humiliation, it fueled this deep, enduring bitterness. In that environment, political uncertainty, chronic economic turmoil, it was the perfect fertile ground for the rise of aggressive nationalism in Germany through the 1920s and into the 30s.
I see why you focus on the economic and psychological impact, and it's a powerful argument. But framing accountability purely as a negative seems incomplete. We really need to see the treaty as attempting two things at once, things that are quite hard to separate. Holding Germany accountable for the unprecedented horrors of the war, and structurally preventing future military aggression. The restrictions imposed, they were seen as vital for European security. Think about France, invaded twice in less than 50 years. They needed assurances.
But were those assurances realistic or just punitive?
Well, the security measures were quite specific and intentional. Germany was limited to a small army, just 100,000 soldiers, basically for internal policing. They were explicitly forbidden from having an air force or a modern navy. That number, 100,000, it wasn't arbitrary. It rendered Germany strategically incapable of launching large-scale offensive operations again. That was a crucial goal for lasting security. And let's not forget the positive structural ambition here. The treaty framework included the creation of the League of Nations. This was revolutionary, designed specifically to promote cooperation, resolve disputes diplomatically, a really significant departure from the old, secretive, balance of power politics that many felt had led to the war in the first place. That sounds optimistic, perhaps, for what was, I think, a structurally compromised document right from the start. Let's go back to the economics, the reparations. It's easy to say Germany deserved to pay. Okay, but the payment structure itself, that staggering sum, it actively drove economic and political uncertainty across Europe, not just within Germany. I mean, how can you realistically expect continental stability when you're deliberately dismantling the economy of its largest industrial power? The intense focus on monetary punishment didn't just devastate the German mark, it worsened global instability. It kind of baked cyclical collapse into the system.
I'm sorry, but I just don't think the reparations alone were the single cause of Europe's instability. I mean, the economic turmoil was already a global reality. The war had devastated the economies of many allied countries, too, especially France and Belgium. They suffered direct, immense material damage. Reparations were seen as necessary compensation for that destruction, not just some, arbitrary act of vengeance.
But the scale.
The scale reflected the scale of the damage. And furthermore, the treaty was doing something else just as important, limiting Germany's global reach. Forcing Germany to give up its colonies and territories wasn't just about punishment. It was a crucial step in curtailing its imperialistic power, its Weltpolitik. That structural limit on global ambition was considered a necessary prerequisite for any kind of lasting regional peace.
Limiting resources, okay, but crippling their ability to actually recover economically, that's different. It's the sheer weight of that debt that I believe delegitimized the peace from the outset for most Germans. And that brings us to the question of justice versus humiliation. You argue establishing accountability was essential. I agree, in principle. But Article 231 went beyond accountability. It became this potent symbol of collective national humiliation. By forcing Germany to accept sole blame for a war with complex origins, the Allies pretty much ensured that almost no German citizen, regardless of their politics, could see the treaty as legitimate. And this profound sense of betrayal, that was the critical psychological element that extremist leaders later capitalized on so effectively. When the Weimar government tried to comply with the terms, it only fueled the narrative that they were weak, that they were betraying the nation. This absolutely contributed to the rise of authoritarian regimes. Compliance became synonymous with national shame.
But establishing clear responsibility was essential for any kind of international justice. It provided the moral basis, for enforcing the military restrictions designed to prevent another conflict on that scale. The Allies saw the aggressive military and political structure of Imperial Germany as the primary driver of the war. The fact that the treaty was explicitly designed to prevent Germany from ever again becoming a major military power, that shows a clear and, I'd argue, necessary intent towards lasting security. We can talk about German national pride, but surely that can't outweigh the need to prevent mass death across the entire continent again?
But by ensuring the wounded humiliation never truly healed, didn't they just postpone that mass death? Exactly. The vision was sound, absolutely. But its potential success was fatally undermined by the U.S. decision to essentially step back right after helping to design it. It wasn't just stepping back, though, was it? It was actively hobbling the mechanism from the very beginning. The U.S. Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. They cited serious concerns about sovereignty and the obligations that joining the League, this collective security arrangement, might impose. This refusal led directly to a damaging period of American isolationism throughout the 1920s. So how could a system based on collective security possibly function effectively when the world's largest creditor, the emerging industrial giant, refused to participate? That structural weakness, caused by the U.S. withdrawal, seems intrinsic to the failure of the entire peace settlement.
That failure is undeniable, yes. And I absolutely agree that American isolationism was short-sighted and incredibly detrimental to the League's potential efficacy. However, I think focusing solely on the U.S. withdrawal can sometimes distract from the other things happening concurrently, the core structural shifts that Versailles did try to address, even if imperfectly. The war's aftermath, it was about more than just flawed statecraft and diplomacy. While politicians were, drawing lines on maps, often poorly, the conflict itself was already catalyzing these profound, unstoppable social changes back home.
Okay, that's a fair point, broadening the scope. And I'll accept that the changes were transformative, yes, but many were deeply negative, weren't they? They demonstrated the failure of the war's promises for many. Look at the intensification of domestic race relations in the U.S., for example. The Chicago race riots during the Red Summer of 1919. African-American soldiers had fought ostensibly for democracy abroad, in segregated units, experienced a degree of acceptance, particularly in France, and then they returned home to face horrific violence and entrenched systemic discrimination. That stark contrast, that shows a failure, doesn't it? A failure of the war to fundamentally improve the status quo for all citizens who sacrificed?
That violence was undoubtedly a tragic manifestation of deep-seated American racial tensions, absolutely. But linking it directly, causally, to the punitive terms of the Treaty of Versailles itself, that feels tenuous to me. On the other hand, the war demonstrably accelerated positive progressive change in ways the treaty, as a political document, never could. Consider the massive influx of women into the workforce during the war, filling roles traditionally held by men. This experience, this visibility, led directly to successful lobbying efforts and the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, women's suffrage in the U.S. That's undeniable, permanent progress resulting directly from the war effort and its conclusion. It reshaped the electorate, global perceptions of gender roles. A profound change. And culturally, too, this sheer collective trauma, the widespread disillusionment with old certainties, with traditional political and moral structures, this gave rise to modernism in the arts, this huge cultural shift, seeking new ways to express a sense of fragmentation, breaking dramatically from established forms. It shows the massive intellectual and social transformation the war ignited. These cultural and social shifts arguably were irreversible and did more to redefine the 20th century than perhaps the political machinations surrounding the League.
So what you're suggesting is that despite the, let's call it, structural failure of the League, exacerbated by U.S. isolationism, and the economic disaster caused by reparations, the war itself still managed to accelerate these irreversible positive domestic changes, and that these changes, like suffrage, ultimately had a more lasting impact on the global power balance, or at least social structures, than the treaty itself. Precisely.
The political execution of the peace settlement was deeply flawed, yes, but the war experience itself, it sort of reset the clock on social development in many areas.
Okay. Well, in closing, my position remains pretty firm. The Treaty of Versailles, largely defined by that punitive Article 231 and the frankly crippling reparations, inflicted a wound on Germany economically and psychologically that never properly healed. By prioritizing, I believe, vengeance over economic stability and political legitimacy, the treaty created the very conditions, the resentment, the desperation that fueled the rise of authoritarianism.
It failed in its primary objective of preventing future conflict, making a second war seem almost an inevitable consequence of the first.
And I maintain that the end of World War I necessitated a global reckoning. It resulted in the, yes, sometimes messy dismantling of old empires, but also the revolutionary birth of new international ideas and institutions like the League. Its ultimate failure rests less with the initial security terms, which, did structurally limit German aggression for a time, and more with the subsequent lack of political will, particularly the isolationist stance of the U.S. Senate, which chose not to fully commit to the global project the treaty, however imperfectly, envisioned.
What we can absolutely agree on, I think, is that the period immediately following the armistice and the signing of Versailles marked an irreversible turning point. It was the beginning of a new era.
Yes, definitely. Whether you focus on the painful geopolitical reshaping, the redrawing of maps, or those profound social transformations we touched on, like the 19th Amendment, the rise of modernism, World War I confirmed the world had fundamentally changed. It ushered in an era defined both by unprecedented potential for progress, but also, tragically, by the destructive cycles of conflict that this particular peace treaty ultimately failed to break.